Welcome to the Positive Spiritual Living Podcast, brought to you by Unity on the Bay. This is your positive path for spiritual living.
So it was Christmas morning, about 2 a.m., and George Stone, 89 years old, is driving home down a road, must say weaving just a little bit, and an officer pulls him over. Says, "Excuse me, sir, but what are you doing out on Christmas morning at 2 a.m.? And he says, "Well, I'm on my way to a lecture." "Really?" "Yeah, it's a lecture on the hazards of alcohol abuse on the human body and the toll it takes on your domestic life." And the officer says, "Now, who in the world is delivering a lecture like that at 2 a.m. on Christmas morning?" And he says, "That would be my wife." Has absolutely nothing to do with my message. I just heard it this week and I thought it was cute. One of my favorite terms in 2 words comes from a book that's had a profound effect on my life. It's written by Unity author. It's a classic, Imelda Octavia Shanklin, and you've heard me use this term before. The book is "What Are You?" and the term is spiritual amnesia. Remember when I've talked about spiritual amnesia before? I love that term because what she's describing is the state that we are all in. We have forgotten who we are. We just plumb forgot. We're walking around in a state of amnesia. We don't know who we are. And most of us have adopted other identities for ourselves, but they're not true, and they're not real. So when I think in terms of that and put it next to the experience that we're all headed toward in just a few weeks, this Christmas day, I think Christmas is really about remembering. Christmas is about remembering who we are. Christmas is about being free of the state of spiritual amnesia. And that was really the mission and the message of the whole ministry of Jesus Christ, was through his own remembrance, then in turn to remind us of the reality of our nature. So it's much more than a date on a calendar. It's much more than the commemoration of something that happened 2,000 years ago. In Unity, we know that Christmas is a here and now experience. And I believe that if Jesus wanted us to celebrate his birthday in any way, it would be to more completely and more convincingly accept for ourselves his charge, which was to live lives of love, to live lives of acceptance, to live lives of compassion. So that's really what Christmas is about. And you can't live that kind of life unless you have discovered for yourself an identity or a definition for yourself that supports you being able to show up in the world with those kinds of qualities. One of the things that I love the most about the Unity way of life is the manner in which we explore the Bible. And you know, we do this what we call metaphysically. That is, we don't so much see all the biblical stories as historically accurate or even that they have to be real necessarily. What we do is we see these stories as stories that contain profound wisdom about the nature of life. So we want to go more deeply than just the words on the page. We want to understand the meanings that are behind these stories. And one of the ladies that really caught that drift, I'm into classic Unity authors this morning, and they're all women. If you don't know this, women had a tremendous role in the development of the Unity movement, beginning with our co-founder, Myrtle Fillmore. And it was through women, through that intuitive feminine nature, that many of our teachings became refined and cultivated. So we're deeply grateful for that. There was a lady by the name of Elizabeth Sand Turner. She actually had a lot of influence in Florida, by the way, because she helped to initiate a lot of the Unity centers and churches that are in this region. She wrote 3 volumes of spiritual metaphysical interpretation of Scripture from the very beginning of the Bible in Genesis to the very end. And she says this, and I love the way she puts this. She says, as the account of the life of Jesus is contemplated, it should be with the understanding that we are witnessing the unfolding of our own consciousness Godward. The events of his life are different from those we encounter, but the underlying principle is the same. In perceiving this, we can read of these events not only as happening to one man 2,000 years ago, but also as stages of our own spiritual progress. So the life and the teaching and the work of Jesus Christ is a statement about the spiritual transformation, evolution, development, and awakening of each of our own individual lives. And it's not really from my own perspective until we realize that this Christ, this Jesus, actually lives in us. Remember that we're one. And it's always within us, calling us up to live by a higher standard. A standard that is not difficult really to achieve because it's our nature. It's our real nature. What's difficult is wandering around on this planet believing that you're something other than Christ, something other than divine perfection in expression. That is difficult indeed. But the more that we actually convince ourselves and believe that we are this Christ idea, this Christ presence, the more beautiful and the more joyous life becomes. Okay, going back in time, and I was trying to figure out actually how many years this was, but it was 1981, so you do the math. I don't know how old my son is. Isn't that just terrible? But I know he was born in 1981, and I know that I was certainly unfamiliar with the whole experience of what it meant to go through a birth and what it meant to go through raising a child, but nonetheless, there I was. And here's the way it happened. At the time, I was working as public relations director at Unity Village in Missouri. And I was downtown attending a lecture, a seminar all day on a Saturday on how to respond to crisis situations in organizations. And back then, and I was just realizing this yesterday, we didn't have cell phones. I mean, maybe a few people had them in their cars, but they were big, bulky things. Remember those? So I got a call, but they had to come into the room, find out who I was, and then say to me, you have a message here. It's to call your wife. And so I stepped out of the How to Manage Crisis Situations seminar, and I went to something called a payphone. Does anyone know what a payphone is? And I put into that payphone coins. Antiquated round metal objects that I hardly see anymore. Plastic has taken their place. I put in coins and I called my wife. And she said, "Sweetheart, I'm pregnant." And immediately I was recalling everything that I had learned from that morning on how to manage crisis situations, because it was like, "Oh my God, you're what? I'm pregnant." So that was the beginning. That was like the report of the conceptualization. And that's the way it is a lot of times when you first get news that something has been conceived. It's shocking, it's surprising, it's wonderful perhaps, but it also has you wondering, what in the world am I going to do with this? And it sort of reestablishes your framework regarding all of life. And then you move from that experience to the 9 months that it takes for that child who's now been conceived to actually be brought into the world. And this is a period where you're excited, because you're going to have this baby and this child, but at the same time, you're kind of freaking out because I've never been a parent before. I don't know the rules. This is going to be a new adventure. So it's kind of exciting, and it's also kind of threatening, I suppose, or at least a little chilling. And then, of course, you move from that into the experience of the actual birth, which in Aaron's case was a very unique experience because they had discovered early on that my wife had a situation called toxemia. So they couldn't let Aaron remain in the womb for very much longer because basically toxemia, the womb just starts to wrap it up, whether the baby's ready to come out or not. So things had to be expedited. And we had been spending months in music therapy. We had the perfect pregnancy planned, a natural birth, and all of a sudden, all of those plans went awry completely. And we had to be rushed in, and they had to try to induce labor, and this went on for the longest time, and it was painful, and it was nothing like what we had imagined. And the music therapist was in there playing stuff like the Hallelujah chorus, and nothing was going on, and it was like he was there literally for hours waiting. We were all just waiting. Come on, what's going to happen? And finally, they decided to do a C-section. So they went in surgically and they took me in there with them. And I thought, oh my God, this is very, very odd, because I'd never been in a surgical operating room or anything like that. So I was even more overwhelmed. I remember holding Karen's hand, and she was so tightly holding mine, and then they put her under, and gradually her grip just started to release. And I thought, no, you can't go away. I need you here, This is something we're supposed to go through together. She was gone, and all of a sudden, the next thing I knew, I was holding this baby, and the first thing that he did was pee on me. So it wasn't what I expected, and so often in birth experiences, it's not what we expect, It's really not. There are surprises around every corner, and so also is the case with raising children. You never know really what to expect or when exactly to expect it. But I wanted to take a look at this threefold process of conception, gestation, and birth, because I believe that they are all three symbolic of stages that are happening in us right now. It begins with conception, and conception from a spiritual perspective is that moment that you catch the first glimpse of who you are. Now, you might be in a room like this, you might be reading a book, listening to a lecture, you might be having a still, quiet moment of reflection, but all of a sudden you just get, even if it's just for a fleeting moment, I could be more than I have believed myself to be. I could be more than society has believed me to be. I could be more. There could be something going on. A new thought gets introduced, and it may seem to even come and go in an instant, but I guarantee you, if you got this new idea, this new understanding or belief of who you are in that moment, it will never leave you again. It'll stay there. It may go unnoticed for a while, but you got it. I could be something more than I believe myself to be. And in that moment, the seed that you have conceived through that tiny little thought or revelation begins to go through a maturation process, a gestation. I remember after, and I'm sure this was the case with both my children, but it's more freshly in my mind with my granddaughter Ashlyn right after she was born. And I think I told you my daughter, the very next day after Ashlyn was born, had to go back into the hospital because she got 103 temperature, and she was in the emergency room, and they didn't want to take Ashlyn in there. So I got to hold Ashlyn for like hours and hours. And I was a little freaked out because I wasn't sure exactly what her expectations would be, but it worked out beautifully. There's nothing like holding a newborn child. If you've never done it, go find one and just hold a newborn child. Because there's something automatically that comes out of a soul that wants to just nurture it and experience it and hold it and be with it. And it's such a rich experience because it's such a privilege to hold new life in your arms. And so I relate that experience to what we must do once that initial idea of who we are gets injected into our consciousness. I could be something more than I believe myself to be. Now, take that seed, take that understanding that you've been given by the grace of God and hold it like you would hold a newborn child. That's the gestation period. That's the period of maturation. And nurture it. How do you nurture it? You nurture it with prayer and you nurture it with education. That is, you start to spend regular times and really hold that understanding of yourself just like a little child, because that's what it is. It appears new to you, though it is the ancient reality of who you are. It appears new to you. So you just hold it and you nurture it through prayer, through quiet reflection, through stillness. And you begin to educate yourself with every ounce of spiritual information and awareness that you can. That's how you're going to feed this new idea of who you are, because you want to take it to the next step, which is the birth. The birth is that moment of conscious awareness where you actually no longer believe in the old identity that you held for yourself. You no longer believe that you are a hell-bound sinner. And I know there's nobody in this room that's probably going to tell anybody, I believe I'm a hell-bound sinner. But there's remnants in us, my friends, because we've had heavy-duty conditioning over many years to believe that we're guilty, that we're shameful, that we're not worthy, that we've done something terribly wrong. We're not exactly certain what it was, but it was so bad that God put out a vendetta against us. And that conditioning goes really, really deep. But there comes a point through the prayer, through the education, through the nurturing of the new identity where you actually become free in the new spiritual awareness of who you are. Now it's no longer theory. Now you're actually living it. Or better yet, I should say, it is being lived through you. Because the Christ identity transcends any understanding or identity or definition you have of yourself right now in this moment. And it begins to live your life. It begins to guide you. It's often called grace. And grace stimulates levels of wisdom that you never knew you had. It stimulates levels of compassion that you've never experienced before. It stimulates an overwhelming sense of love. All of a sudden, you can't explain it, but you wake up and you're just loving everybody. Even people that you absolutely despised a couple days ago, you're just loving them. It's because you re-identified yourself and these capacities become awakened. You start to actually live the life. Now, Elizabeth Sand Turner, in this threefold series of metaphysical interpretation, she goes on to say, in Bible interpretation as given by Charles Fillmore, who's the co-founder of the Unity Movement, if you don't know that, in Bible interpretation as given by Charles Fillmore, men represent that phase of the soul we term mind, and women represent the emotional or feeling nature of the soul. Now, whether you realize this or not, allow me to inform you this morning that there is a masculine nature and there is a feminine nature in every one of us. One of the things Juan and I had the pleasure and privilege of being a part of this last Tuesday, was that we got to go down to the commissioners' meeting and share some comments in support of the equal rights of gender expression and gender identity. Thank you. And I've been kind of, aside from the immense significance of equal rights on this planet, I know there was something greater to this for me personally. And what it was the gender expression. That, part of our conditioning in this world, it's deeply rooted. If you end up on the planet in a male body, there's certain ways that are acceptable to show up and certain ways that are not acceptable to show up. And the same if you wind up in a female body. And I'm sorry, but to me, that is absolutely whacked out. It doesn't make any sense at all. We're all beautiful human beings. And we all have a masculine side and a feminine side, but most of us guys are walking around going, oh my God, whatever happens, don't let my feminine side out. And the women are running around going, well, don't make me act like a man here. But the liberation process, which we've incompletely referred to as female liberation, but it's really human liberation, is forcing all of us to realize that we have both of these dimensions. And an important part of the Christmas story is letting those two dimensions thrive inside of us, because you can't step into the identity of the Christ idea unless you have a highly refined and developed feminine nature and a highly refined and developed masculine nature. Let's take a look at these. It begins with Mary, the feminine nature. And here's some words to describe what this is inside of you right now. And you're going to find as humanity continues to evolve, these aspects are going to want to come up. And they're not going to take no for an answer. So we might as well all just get used to being complete and full, total human beings in expression. Mary represents the feminine. She represents the intuition. She represents purity. And she represents love. Now, every one of us has these qualities. I especially emphasize this morning the intuitive nature, because part of our social conditioning has been to resort only to our heads, to our intellect, to analysis, to statistic, to fact. And so most of us are trapped up there, especially guys, because we don't think we have any intuition. We figure all the women have the intuition, and we just lost out on that deal. Not so. We're all deeply intuitive. So when this feminine nature comes up, let it come up, let it thrive. And don't worry about how that's going to be perceived by people outside of you. See, that's the whole thing. That's why if you are in a man's body and you feel inclined to express with a feminine nature, there's so much to overcome, and yet every time somebody overcomes that, they're not just overcoming it for themselves, they're overcoming it for the whole human race. So that all of us guys can learn to cry, can learn to be intuitive, can learn to express our emotions, can think of ourselves as being pure and undefiled, and we can love. In the case of Joseph, it's the same, only it's the opposite end of the spectrum. Those masculine qualities, the intellect, the understanding, the wisdom, also strength and power are associated with this. But let me tell you, all these qualities lie within every single woman on the planet. And so we need to learn to let them come up when their time arrives. You can't birth the new identity of who you are unless.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Positive Spiritual Living Podcast, brought to you by Unity on the Bay, a spiritual community located in Miami, Florida. Unity on the Bay is supported by the generosity of its community. If you'd like to make a donation or learn more about Unity on the Bay, please visit unityonthebay.org. You can also follow Unity on the Bay on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for even more positive spiritual inspiration. Until next time, thanks for listening and many blessings. Namaste.